The question now wasn't whether he would apologize. It was whether he truly understood what he had done, and more importantly, what he was going to do next. The manager opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. His face was pale now, his confidence crumbling under the weight of his mistake. He looked around the lobby, realizing how many people had witnessed this moment. His employees, hotel guests, strangers who would carry this story beyond these walls. He had built a reputation on professionalism, on running a high-end establishment with impeccable service, and yet, in just a few minutes, he had exposed a flaw he couldn't ignore. The woman waited, her expression unreadable. She wasn't angry, at least not in the way he had expected. There was no shouting, no dramatic confrontation. That almost made it worse. She had given him a chance to see his mistake for himself, and now she was giving him a chance to fix it. But before he could say anything, the sound of fast-approaching footsteps cut through the tension. A man in a navy blue suit, his tie slightly loosened as if he had rushed down in a hurry, entered the lobby with wide eyes. The hotel's regional director. He barely glanced at the manager before heading straight to the woman. "Miss Carter," he said breathlessly, his voice laced with both relief and concern. "I am so sorry. I just received the call. I had no idea you were here." The murmur of voices in the lobby grew louder. Some guests turned to each other, whispering. The front desk staff looked even more uneasy now, realizing the situation had escalated beyond what any of them had expected. The woman, Miss Carter, simply nodded, her calm demeanor unchanged. "I was just taking a look around," she said, her voice even. "Though it seems your staff didn't expect me." The regional director stiffened. He turned toward the manager, his jaw tightening. "Tell me," he said, his tone sharp now. "Did you seriously just try to remove the owner from her own hotel?" The manager swallowed hard, but before he could answer, Miss Carter spoke again. "It's not just about me," she said, glancing at the young employee who had recognized her. "It's about what this means. How many others have been treated this way when no one was watching?" A new wave of tension spread through the room. The guests who had been watching so intently suddenly seemed to shift in their seats, as if realizing the bigger question. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a pattern. The regional director turned back to the manager, his expression unreadable. "We're going to have a long conversation about this." But Miss Carter wasn't finished. She took a slow step forward, her eyes sharp. "Actually," she said, her voice steady, "I think that conversation should happen right now." The manager's face drained of color. The entire lobby held its breath. And just like that, the stakes had been raised higher than anyone had expected. The lobby was silent, thick with tension. All eyes were on Miss Carter as she stood tall waiting. The regional director shifted uncomfortably before glancing at the manager. "You heard her," he said firmly. "Let's have that conversation. Right now." The manager swallowed hard, his face tight with embarrassment. He was used to being the one in control, the one making the decisions. But now, with the weight of his mistake pressing down on him and the entire room watching, he felt powerless. He hesitated for a moment, as if considering his options, but deep down, he knew he had none. I truly didn't realize," he said finally, his voice quiet. "It was never my intention to be disrespectful." Miss Carter studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "Not realizing isn't an excuse," she said. "Your first instinct was to dismiss me. To assume I didn't belong. That's the problem." The regional director nodded, his expression tight. "This is unacceptable," he said. "We'll be addressing this immediately. There will be consequences." But Miss Carter held up a hand, stopping him. "I don't just want consequences," she said, turning to face the entire staff behind the desk. "I want change." The employees, including the young woman who had recognized her, straightened at her words. The manager's face was still tense, but now there was something else, understanding. He had spent years thinking he knew how to run this hotel, believing he treated all guests the same. But today had shown him something different. Before he could respond, the unexpected happened. From the back of the lobby, an older man stepped forward, his expression hesitant but determined. He was a long-time guest, someone who had been staying at the hotel for years. "Miss Carter," he said, clearing his throat, "I want you to know. I've seen this before, not just today." A ripple went through the room. Miss Carter turned to him, her gaze steady. "Tell me," she said. Miss Carter gave a small nod, as if she had expected this. "That's why this conversation matters," she said, "because this isn't just about me. It's about making sure no one else walks through these doors and feels like they don't belong in a place they have every right to be." The manager exhaled slowly, nodding. "You're right," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "And I know words aren't enough, but I want to do better." Miss Carter studied him before finally speaking. "Then prove it," she said simply, "starting today." The regional director nodded. "Consider it done." The tension in the room finally started to shift. The moment had reached its peak, but its impact would last far beyond today. Miss Carter had come here expecting to check in on her hotel, but instead, she had exposed something bigger. And now everyone in the room knew things couldn't go back to the way they were. As she turned to leave, the young employee who had spoken up earlier called after her, "Miss Carter." She paused, turning back. The young woman hesitated, then straightened her shoulders. "Thank you." Miss Carter gave her a knowing smile. "Keep speaking up," she said. "It makes a difference." And with that, she walked out, leaving behind a hotel that would never be the same again. As Miss Carter stepped outside, the cool evening air met her skin, a stark contrast to the heated exchange that had just taken place in the lobby. She paused for a moment, taking in a deep breath, letting it all settle. This wasn't the first time she had faced a moment like this, but something about today felt different. Maybe it was the way the truth had unfolded, not just for her, but for everyone in that room. A moment of reckoning, long overdue. Behind her, the glass doors reflected the hotel's golden glow, and for a second, she saw her own face staring back at her, calm, steady, but tired. She had built this place, poured years of her life into it, and yet, the reality of how she had been treated within its walls still lingered. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but today was a start. A voice pulled her from her thoughts. The young employee, the one who had recognized her, had followed her outside. "Miss Carter," she called hesitantly, her breath visible in the crisp night air. Miss Carter turned, offering a small smile. "Yes." The young woman hesitated, choosing her words carefully. I wanted to say, what you did in there, it meant something. Not just to me, but to a lot of people. I've seen things happen before, but no one ever speaks up. And if they do, no one listens." She exhaled, looking down for a moment. "You changed that tonight." Miss Carter studied her for a moment. The sincerity in her voice, the quiet strength. It reminded her of herself years ago, when she was just getting started, when she was still learning that speaking up was the only way to make room for change. "What's your name?" Miss Carter asked. The young woman straightened slightly. "Elena." Miss Carter nodded. "Elena, you saw what happened in there. You saw how easy it is for people to make assumptions, how dangerous silence can be." She tilted her head slightly. "So now you have a choice. Do you stay silent, or do you make sure this place becomes better than it was before?" Elena didn't even have to think about it. "I want to make it better," she said firmly. Miss Carter smiled. "Good." She reached into her purse and pulled out a business card, pressing it into Elena's hand. "If you ever feel like your voice isn't being heard, call me." Elena's fingers closed around the card, holding it like it meant more than just contact information. It was a reminder that she wasn't powerless. As she turned to leave, Miss Carter caught a glimpse of movement inside the hotel. The manager stood near the front desk, deep in conversation with the regional director. His shoulders were tense, his expression serious. He wasn't the same man who had looked at her with doubt and dismissal earlier that evening. Something had shifted. Whether he realized it or not, Tonight had changed him too. She didn't need to stay to see how the rest of the night would unfold. The work was just beginning, and it wasn't hers alone to do. And just like that, the power in the room had shifted. A heavy silence settled over the lobby. The weight of the moment was sinking in, but no one dared to speak first. The manager, still gripping the documents, looked as if he wished the ground would swallow him whole. The front desk agent stared at the counter, their earlier arrogance replaced by quiet panic. Even the security guard, who had been ready to escort her out just minutes ago, suddenly seemed unsure of what to do with his hands. The woman let the silence stretch, watching as they all struggled with the realization. It wasn't just about the mistake they had made, it was about what the mistake represented. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a simple misunderstanding. It was a pattern, one she had seen play out in different ways her entire life. She took a slow step forward, forcing the manager to finally meet her eyes. "Tell me," she said, her voice softer now, but no less powerful. "What made you so sure I didn't belong here?" The manager's mouth opened, then closed again. He knew there was no good answer, no excuse that wouldn't sound hollow. His face flushed with embarrassment. I wasn't aware." She raised a brow. "No, you weren't." A few guests had stopped pretending not to listen, their eyes darting between her and the hotel staff. Some looked uncomfortable, others intrigued. A man in a suit, standing near the elevator, shifted awkwardly as if debating whether he should intervene. A woman with a rolling suitcase whispered something to her companion. But it wasn't just the guests who had noticed. Behind the front desk, a young employee who had remained silent this whole time took a cautious step forward. She had been watching everything unfold, her expression a mix of shock and something else, recognition. "I knew who you were," the young employee blurted out, her voice quiet but firm. The manager snapped his head toward her, his eyes narrowing. "What?" "I knew," the woman repeated, glancing at the owner before looking back at her boss. "I recognized her from an article last year, when the hotel expanded." The owner's eyes softened slightly as she studied the young employee. There was something refreshing about her honesty. The manager swallowed hard. He had no choice but to acknowledge what was happening now. The truth was out, and the tension in the room was no longer just about one woman being turned away. It was about what it meant for everyone watching. And yet, the real question remained, what was he going to do about it? The air in the lobby grew thick with tension. The manager shifted uncomfortably, still holding the folder as if it carried the weight of his mistake. His usual confidence had vanished, replaced by a nervous stiffness. He glanced around, as if searching for an escape, but there was none. The guests watching, the employees standing frozen behind the desk, everyone was waiting for his next move. The woman, still calm but unwavering, took another step closer. "So," she said, tilting her head slightly, "what happens now?" The manager cleared his throat, his fingers gripping the folder tighter. I apologize for the misunderstanding," he said quickly, his voice stiff and rehearsed. A few people exchanged glances. The young employee who had spoken up earlier frowned, sensing the emptiness in his words. The woman studying him let a small, knowing smile cross her lips. "A misunderstanding," she repeated, letting the words hang in the air. "Is that what this was?" The manager hesitated, clearly realizing his mistake. His attempt to smooth things over wasn't working. The woman wasn't just looking for an apology, she was waiting for something deeper, something real. The security guard, who had been silent since realizing the truth, took a slow step back. He understood now that he had acted too quickly, too eagerly, without stopping to ask the right questions. The front desk agent, standing beside the manager, seemed to shrink under the weight of it all. From the corner of the lobby, a guest finally broke the silence. "Is she really the owner?" The man in the suit asked, his voice low but clear. The young employee answered before the manager could. "Yes," she said firmly. "She built this hotel." A few hushed murmurs spread through the room. People had seen stories like this before, but to witness it firsthand, to see the judgment, The assumptions, the power shift right before their eyes, was something else entirely. The woman let out a quiet sigh, glancing around at the space she had worked so hard to create. It wasn't just a business to her. It was a vision, a reflection of years of hard work, late nights, and sacrifices. And yet, despite everything she had built, she had been treated like she didn't belong. She turned back to the manager, watching him struggle to find the right words. The truth was, there were no words that could undo what had just happened. As she walked toward her car, she thought back to the guest who had spoken up, the man who had finally acknowledged what he had seen for years but had never addressed. People were starting to see things they had once ignored. That was the first step. Sliding into the driver's seat, she took one last look at the building. It was beautiful, standing tall, glowing against the night sky. But a building was only as strong as the foundation it stood on, and tonight a crack had been exposed. She started the engine, the quiet hum filling the space around her. She had come here expecting just another visit, another check-in on her investment, but she was leaving with something more. A reminder that no matter how much she built, how much she achieved, the fight to be seen, to be respected, was never really over. But as long as she had a voice, she would use it. And tonight, for the first time in a long time, she knew she wasn't alone in that fight.